Hi, my name is Allison Grenda, and I'm a graduating master's student in art history at UC Davis. I am proud to present to you today my master's thesis entitled Dark Age Re-Enlightened, a reassessment of the archaeological and architectural evidence of 7th century CE Athens. The Mediterranean world in the 7th century was a time of notorious upheaval. Violent conflict, natural disasters, economic turmoil, political change, and religious conversions racked the former Roman Empire, ushering in what scholars have long labeled a Dark Age, a period of obscured chaos between the traditional epochs of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Yet recently, there has been an upswing in the efforts to dispel this outdated term. In Greece, and Athens specifically, there has been little study of the 7th century, and never a sole work devoted to this time and place. Instead, this period has been labeled a dark age and derided, ignored, or written off as insignificant. I seek to revise this perspective by reassessing the material evidence of 7th century CE Athens. I am bringing together for the first time archaeological remains and architectural history from across the city to provide a more comprehensive map of Athens in the 7th century. In doing so, I am arguing for Athens' importance in this era as a religious center, a fixture in the minds of the Byzantine elite, and a community of people maintaining their town in a troubled time. Above all, however, I am pushing for a change in how the so-called Dark Ages are perceived and how history is studied, calling for a move away from the biased prioritization of certain eras and toward a more objective understanding of the diachronic past. In this way, I hope to not only shed light on the Dark Ages, but argue for a removal of the shade that ever blocked our view. These are the major events in Athens' Roman and late antique history. The city came under Roman control in 86 BC and was invaded multiple times in late antiquity, as well as to face the challenge of being a staunchly pagan city in an increasingly Christian empire. In 529, the emperor closed the pagan schools, an event that one leading scholar called the, quote, death knell of the city, the time when, quote, Athens began a decline into insignificance. This, in the traditional narrative, was the beginning of the end for Athens. The era immediately following Athens' sack by Slavic armies in 582 CE has been shrouded in darkness by scholars, largely due to the lack of textual evidence, but also, as we will see, due to the biases of historians and archaeologists. There exists a contradictory dichotomy in the majority of scholarship on 7th century Athens. Overall, it is consistently agreed that little is known. Yet despite this lack of knowledge, scholars feel justified in characterizing it as a backwater, abandoned, or of little to no significance, and they heavily prioritize the history that came before it. The root of this problem, I argue, is that most scholars approach this era with preconceived notions of what it must be. They subscribe to the traditional idea of rise and decline, that if a city had a height, as it is generally agreed that Athens did in the classical era, then it must also have had a fall. You see here before you Edward Gibbon's landmark series, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The traditional date of the fall of Rome has always been 476 CE, but those living in the Byzantine Empire were actually calling themselves Romans well into the 15th century. So did Rome actually fall in 476, or did it just move east? Did it just change with the passage of time, as all civilizations do? Some columns may have crumbled, as we see on the spines of the books, but just as many were reused in Christian churches and didn't suffer even a crack. For Athens, it has been decided that the city fell in 582, after the sack by the Slavic tribes. This is a nice story. It's an easy story. It's one that has satisfactorily concluded many a scholar's book on ancient Athens. But when these scholars enter their research with this arc already in mind, then it skews how they perceive the actual evidence. They see what they want to see, and that is destruction, ruin, and ultimately, the death of the city, a tidy conclusion to their tale of heroic ancient Athens. An example of this can be seen in the excavation reports of the 7th century material. To be sure, one excavator wrote in 1972, very little of this occupation is likely to have been in any way ennobling to the ancient name of Athens. Even if a ray of light from these new excavations may here begin to dispel the archaeological obscurity of the Dark Ages in Athens, it will not be thought to have revealed an age in which the quality of life was much less dark. It goes without saying that there is a clear bias at work here. Since antiquity, classical Athens has been awarded a status above all others, a shining city of high learning, groundbreaking architecture, and supreme character that supposedly represents the pinnacle of Western civilization. When this viewpoint exists, it thereby lends itself to the creation of a supposed fact, an inherent and unopposable truth that any other form of Athens must pale in comparison. But what if that initial judgment, that which places classical Athens on an Acropolis above all other eras, is for a moment suspended? The glorification of one era necessarily invites a comparison that sneers at anything below that pinnacle. It is for this reason that so little is known about late antique, Dark Age Athens. Likewise, it is for this reason that that which we do know is colored by judgment which unfairly compares it to an unattainable past. I understand why we do this. This fixation on classical Athens is not unfounded considering the significant effects of classical Athenian philosophy on modern democratic governments. It is dangerous, though, when it overtakes or unjustly influences the study of the rest of the city's history. Western thinkers claimed classical Athens as an ancestor, tracing the roots of democracy from Athens to Capitol Hill, but somewhere along the way, they disowned the Byzantine branch of the family tree. Although the same location physically, late antique and Byzantine Athens were seen as part of the history of the Orthodox Church, and therefore not part of the Western narrative, causing it to be massively understudied and misunderstood by Western scholars. There is also the long tendency of art historians to characterize places and periods into boxes together. You have classical art in Athens in one box, the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople in another box, the Italian Renaissance and Florence in yet another. We tend to follow the centers of power, and then we box them up with their respective eras. While we easily understand each on its own, Athens, the Parthenon, the Greek gods, and separately Byzantium and the Eastern Church, it is somehow more difficult to grapple with and therefore categorize the liminal space, something like 7th century Athens, which is neither fully ancient nor medieval. So scholars are faced with the impossible decision of which box to put it in, so instead they ignore it. It floats without study, despite its pivotal position as the link between the ancient and the medieval. This is seen clearly in the history of the Parthenon. Now, the Parthenon is crucial to our study of 7th century Athens. On the slide before you, you can see the form that it would have taken starting in the 5th century CE, when it was converted into a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was also a significant pilgrimage site, so it actually drew visitors into late antique and Byzantine Athens. It also likely served as the city's main church for visiting and local religious and imperial officials throughout the Byzantine era. So right away, this evidence aids in dispelling the Dark Age myth surrounding 7th century Athens, for it proves that Athens was well visited, well occupied, and well regarded. Perhaps most of all, however, the Parthenon serves as an emblem for explaining why the Dark Age myth of Athens began at all. I mentioned earlier this need that art historians have to characterize places and time periods together. Well, because the Parthenon has been firmly solidified as a classical monument, Athens as a whole came to be seen as a classical monument, to the point that for most other historians, as I have stated earlier in this piece, all other eras were disregarded as insignificant. This was a dangerous trap for the neoclassically minded Europeans who came to Greece during their grand tours and chose to see only ancient ruins. And it pervaded the view of the German archaeologists who excavated the Acropolis. In 1834, at an opening ceremony on the Acropolis to rededicate the Parthenon as an ancient monument, German architect Leo von Klenz announced, "All the remains of barbarity will be removed, here as in all Greece, and the remains of the glorious past will be brought in new light as the solid foundation of a glorious present and future." Over the next 60 years, all non-classical remnants on the Acropolis were completely destroyed, including all evidence of the Parthenon's Christian phase. But the reality is that the Parthenon served as a Christian church for nearly 1,000 years, the same length of time that it acted as a temple to Athena. When the Ottomans took over Athens in 1458, the Parthenon was transformed again and again into a mosque, a military fortress, and a mosque again. And now today, it is a tourism site, masquerading as an ode to a purely classical past. When you go to the Acropolis, what you are seeing is a carefully constructed image, one that certain people with certain beliefs chose to promote. Everything else, the city's Christian era, its Ottoman era, and anything from the 7th century for our purposes, was literally erased. Certain shortcomings in researching this Dark Age era are unfortunately unavoidable. Because of the historical priorities I've discussed, when archaeologists excavate in Athens, even today, as I saw firsthand this summer when I was there, they tend to tear through the late antique and Byzantine material rather than leave it in place because they want to get to what's below that, the classical layers. While the finds are recorded, the material itself is either hidden away in a storeroom or discarded altogether, and architectural elements like walls or floors are totally broken down. Furthermore, the records in the early years of excavations were often handwritten and messy, making it nearly impossible to piece together exactly what the archaeologists found. You can see an example of a notebook from 1939 here. Similar words often become indistinguishable, leaving scholars like me today wondering if it was a wall or a well that the early archaeologists found. And because so little is left in place, it's very difficult to verify the accuracy of both the reports written by the original archaeologists and our interpretive understanding of them today. Nevertheless, this is not a justification to abandon study of the era, but instead an even more crucial reason that research is needed. So, how exactly do we know that 7th century Athens was a fully functioning city with vitality and resilience, and not a city that had died? Well, here before you, you see a map of Athens, and you can see the Acropolis here where the Parthenon is. In my paper, I discuss in depth the multiple churches that would have been active in the 7th century in Athens, almost all of which received significant upgrades or construction work in the 7th century. This includes the former temples of the Erechtheion, also on the Acropolis, and the Hephaestion to the west, as well as a church here in the center of town. Now, next to the Acropolis is a hill called the Areopagus, which is famous as the site where St. Paul preached to the Athenians. And on the slope of the Areopagus, here, lies the 16th century remains of the Church of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, dedicated to the one man that Paul is said to have converted in Athens. Here is the site today, or in 1964, but it looks quite similar today. So historical sources from the 13th and 15th centuries discuss seeing a church on this site, indicating that the 16th century iteration was likely not its first phase. When excavating, archaeologists found possible evidence for a late 6th or 7th century iteration, but this has only been mentioned in passing and never analyzed in depth, despite its serious implications for the urban functions of 7th century Athens. If this church was built in the 7th century, it shows that the people would have had the wealth, physical materials, manpower, and art and architectural design skills to do so, demonstrating a community far from dead or insignificant. The case for an earlier church revolves mainly around a cemetery and some architectural fragments. Early excavations found a cemetery directly next to the church foundations, and this cemetery is almost definitively dated to the 7th century CE. 9 belt buckles, which you can see here in the upper image, were found in the cemetery's graves. Based on contemporaneous examples like those that we see in the lower images, we can confidently date them to around the 7th century. But how does a cemetery confirm the construction of a church? Well, earlier it was the Roman tradition to bury the dead outside the city limits, and prior to this, all Athenian burials were done on the outskirts of town, far from the Areopagus. However, the Christian era ushered in a new practice of laying the faithful to rest in, beneath, or near churches. Across the Byzantine Empire, the cemetery church was a widespread form of architecture. And here is the kicker. Every other cemetery in Athens, built in the early Christian era, had a corresponding church. So, I quote the few archaeologists who have acknowledged an earlier phase to this church. The presence of a cemetery is not in itself conclusive proof of the existence of a contemporary church, but it suggests a strong probability. So just to reiterate, graves were found on site that are essentially confirmed to be from the 7th century. In the 7th century, burials were almost always done next to churches, and in Athens specifically, we do not see any Christian cemeteries without churches next to them. Ergo, there must have been a church next to this cemetery in the 7th century. But in case you are still not convinced, let's look at some architectural fragments. So these were found in the 16th century church while excavating, but they can be arguably dated to the 7th century. 7th century church decoration is characterized by geometric and foliate designs, birds, and animals. The only Christian symbol to appear is the cross. This is extremely general, and it demonstrates the inherent problems of dating early Christian churches. However, although this description is vague, it does match the design of the fragments from St. Dionysius. So on the column capital to your left, we see foliage on each side's face and leaves in the broad triangular corners. There's also a small cross in the strip above the central design. This abstract design of foliage with a small cross matches general 7th century church decoration. Its relative simplicity may also indicate its creation during a time like the 7th century. Unlike the artists of more opulent churches in Constantinople, those of the 7th century in a provincial town like Athens were likely working from just above a subsistence level, making them perhaps not as trained or skilled. They also may have been local to Athens rather than hired and brought from the metropole. Athens was admittedly not a huge city at this time, so it is natural that its art would reflect that of a modest village rather than a cultural power, with simpler designs and somewhat less innovation. Therefore, the simplicity of this capital on your left would further support a 7th century creation date. On your right, in the upper image, we see geometric designs on the impost block from the church. This type of design is echoed on another piece of Athenian church art, seen below, from the Areopagus on the Acropolis, which we know is from the 7th century. The emphasis on geometry and this idea of a multi-rimmed rhombus or diamond shape with that central motif is mirrored in each. Therefore, it would follow that these architectural elements are possibly contemporaneous, and it would add credence to the idea that the Church of St. Dionysius the Areopagite had a 7th century iteration. So, why is it important that this church was built in the 7th century? Well, unlike the Areopagus, which was converted from a temple into a church in the early 7th century, the Church of St. Dionysius would have been an entirely new creation. This would surely point to a dynamic city, with the resources, energy, and design capabilities to build a new church after the crisis of the Slavic sack. Furthermore, both the construction of the Church of St. Dionysius the Areopagite and the Areopagus renovation show not just manpower, but a certain spirituality. Athens as a city on its knees, yes, but not from devastation as previously thought, from worship. In the time remaining, I want to discuss a couple of major administrative buildings from the 7th century. The first relates to the Byzantine Emperor Constans II, who, we know from textual sources, visited Athens in the winter of 662 to 663. This visit on its own is significant. It shows that there must have been enough of an urban environment and active infrastructure in Athens to accommodate the emperor, his entourage, and the many troops that would have been with him as part of the larger military campaign he was on. The presence of Constans II and his men is seen in the city center through the so-called Broad Street building, which, as you may have guessed from its clever name, sat along a broad street. This building originally dates to the 5th century, which is the phase that these pictures represent, when it likely functioned as an office or meeting hall for a public official. Around 662, it was massively refurbished, likely to meet the needs of the visiting emperor and his court. Destruction debris from the Slavic sack was swept into pits, the floors were repacked with clean earth, and tile floors were laid in the lower levels rooms. The colonnade that you see in the lower image would have been divided into rooms in the 7th century, and although the exact use of these is unclear, it clearly points to a need to accommodate a large number of people. This building would have been an understandable choice for the emperor's administrative center while in Athens, because it had served a similar purpose since the 5th century. The Broad Street building is also significant for a few more reasons. First, like the church, for both the resources and the manpower required to renovate it. If the death knell of the city had truly come in the 6th century, we would not see an effort of this size in the 7th. It also points again to a population above subsistence. So these people were not just scraping by, barely trying to survive, but clearly some level of wealth was present. Lastly, it is important for its role as the hub of imperial activity in Athens. The fact that Athens even registered on the emperor's mind, that he would have deemed it fit for him to stay for a winter, shows that it was clearly not a dead or abandoned city, because if it was, the emperor likely would have chosen another town to stay in. The second major administrative building in 7th century Athens is one which only recently has come to light in excavations done under the new Acropolis Museum. This location in the 7th century city's layout is significant. So as you can see, the Broad Street building that we were just discussing is north of the Acropolis, and it has traditionally been believed that the late antique community was tightly clustered around this area, which was surrounded by the city wall. However, the building that I am about to discuss is here, south of the Acropolis. So this tells us that the settlement in the 7th century was actually much more spread out than initially thought. They were not clustered, but the settlement actually extended outside of the city walls. So this indicates that they must have felt some level of safety. In late antiquity, around the 5th century CE, this area to the south of the Acropolis was mainly a residential district. The largest and most opulent of these houses is Building Z, which featured a rare private in-home bath and decorative mosaic floors, which are seen here. In the 7th century, Building Z was significantly remodeled with a completely new 2-story wing added. And this wing was large enough that it was given its own name by archaeologists, Building E. And I'm going to read you a short description of the building from the archaeologists. Building E, quote, featured wells, reservoirs, and storerooms where water and foodstuffs could be cached in troubled times, an upper floor living area, a large apsidal reception hall, a small three-niched chamber that may have been a ceremonial dining room or a chapel for private worship, and a circular tower-like structure. And on the screen before you, that circular tower-like structure is going to be the most evident to you. So if you look for that blue curved line in every image, it's outlining the same thing. It's outlining that same part of the tower. And then I've also indicated with an arrow where the stairs to the second level were located, although that second level no longer exists. This building, in all, contains features rarely seen elsewhere in Athens, representing ingenuity in the 7th century. Building E may have served administrative purposes like the Broad Street building, since they both contain that large reception hall with an apse, which is just a rounded end, showing that it would have been a good meeting hall. Or if it was privately owned, then it would have been a good place for the homeowner to receive guests. I think this speaks to the idea of community in 7th century Athens. This was not a building in which to isolate oneself in fear. Yes, we do have that tower feature, which may have been a defensive addition, but we also see features for socializing and doing business. We see possibly a large dining room for entertaining. So these people are not just sitting sequestered in fear, as I think one might imagine when we hear the term Dark Ages, but there was clearly a social component to Athenian culture in the 7th century, which again speaks to the vitality of the city. 1 year ago, in June 2019, the Acropolis Museum opened these excavations to the public and officially incorporated them into their permanent exhibition. Building E, along with the other surrounding late antique remains, is an integral part of this public site. Its distinctive round tower base is impossible to miss when you visit, and its design is featured prominently in marketing materials and gift shop souvenirs like those seen here. A rare, if not unprecedented feat for a 7th century Athenian ruin. For centuries, archaeologists have ripped through the Byzantine layers of Athens history to get to the classical period, destroying countless historical monuments along the way. But here, that outdated practice is finally changing. 7th century remains are not only left in place, but are on inspirational full display. They are not disregarded in Athens' urban history, but are fully embraced and celebrated. They represent that first step in changing the modern mindset toward post-classical Athens, not just in academic scholarship, but among the public. This, I argue, must be the future of Athenian archaeology, inclusive of all eras and unbiased in its presentation of history. It is undeniable that the 7th century was a challenging time for the city. Yet this is not a reason to disregard it as part of a dark age that we may never understand, nor is it a justification for passing hierarchical value judgments. Instead, we should open-mindedly endeavor to broaden our understanding of the time period using the available evidence. Large-scale construction, from church building to the renovation of the Broad Street building to the construction of Building E, demonstrates a community that was not totally devastated by the Slavic invasion. It had the resources and the labor force to carry out these projects, as well as the willpower to continue growing the town. The Athenians did not give up or die out. Instead, they worked through the crisis to improve their community. A new day is dawning in Athens. As we today study the history of Athens, rather than doing so through a lens of hierarchical comparisons, I argue that it should be done in the pursuit of a more objective truth. If we truly wish to know what Athens was like in the 7th century, we must stop prioritizing to the point of erasure, and we must stop comparing it with a classical city that existed 1,100 years prior to it. Instead, 7th century Athens should be assessed in its own right, as a small, Greek, late antique town, far from the imperial center, but trying to survive and succeed as any other settlement at that time, undergoing the foremost challenges of the late antique era and trying to forge a new path. Moving forward, what if we attempt to neither admire nor degrade the 7th century city, but rather seek to earnestly understand the difficulties of the time and the Athenians' response to them? It is an obvious and correct function of scholarship that an opinion must be stated. However, it need not be a value judgment. While many deride this period as dark, I argue that that which we do know outshines that which we do not. By reassessing the evidence, a practice which should be applied to all cities assigned a Dark Age era, we know that life continued after crisis, as the Athenians maintained their city in a turbulent time. The evidence is there. We just need to turn on the light. So I conclude, fiat lux, Let there be light, and let no age be called dark again. Thank you.